So the next part is where things get exciting, even more than they were this morning. And I'd like to invite my two colleagues onto stage. So these two colleagues, like many colleagues in WWF, are our thought leaders. They're the ones that form partnerships. They grapple with the science, they grapple with the complexity, and they help us make sense and guide the organization as to where it takes its next steps, who it works with next, and how it looks and addresses the challenges and the opportunities that South Africa is presented with. So without any further over-introduction, I'd like to invite Tatiana van Borman and Mkhululi Silandela. Please come onto stage to set the scene for us. Please welcome.
Thank you, Augustine. Can you hear me? Yes, now you can. So I think you'll all agree that some of our best conversations are had over a meal. We get together around dining room tables, banquet tables, campfires, canteens, and we talk. We talk over food. And those can be incredibly powerful transformations. They can build relationships and fuel cooperation. So today, we're coming together to have a conversation and later to share a meal with you. And Mkhululi and I hope to engage you in a really important conversation around how we transform our food system, a really urgent conversation. But I'd like to start with a quick question from left field. And some of you may have heard me ask this last night of a smaller group, so no answering if you heard me ask it last night. But does anybody know what common foodstuff was dyed bright pink when it first appeared on the market way back when? I'm going to ask Mkhululi, actually. I'm worried somebody's going to shout out who was there last night.
Bright pink? I have no idea.
It's margarine. Yeah. Margarine is an oil-based product, and it has no color. I mean, maybe, congealed oil is whitish. So it was dyed pink to advertise its artificiality, to advertise that it wasn't a butter.
I did not know that, I'll be honest. But what is your point, Tatiana?
It's a fair question. But it occurred to me recently when I heard at a global food conference the chief agricultural officer of Mars Food Company saying that we needed to develop some simple definitions and rules for what is food. And where did he encourage us to start? He suggested that we think that if food is not nutritious and not safe, it's not food. And I think it's a radical point, actually, made even more so by the fact that it was given to us from Mars, not the planet, but the company that made its name on chocolates. And the powerful thing there is that he was arguing there not for shareholder value, but he was actually arguing for a greater evidence of care from food companies. And I think that's something we're all eagerly looking for. We've come a very long time since margarine first hit our shelves in the late 1800s, when governments still felt that people needed to know the difference between food created in a lab and food created in nature. But even though we've traveled so far and our food production just in the last 50 or 60 years has changed so much, I think most of us, on some level, still think somebody's watching out for our welfare, that somebody is still taking care, ensuring that the food that we find on the shelves when we go shopping is safe and nutritious, and that it's safe because we know where it comes from, right?
Now I see where you're going, Tatiana. You see, what has happened in the last 60 years, so much has changed that even experts like Ray Goldberg, the father of the agribusiness concept, says the food system has changed so much that in 1955 it was easy to define it. But redefining it now is much more difficult. And this is because the food system has become so sophisticated. from supplier companies to consumer companies. So food has become culture, it is economic development, and it is health. So even though the food system has done an astonishing job of producing more food, I still worry though that the environmental and social failures of our food system leave much to be talked about. You could argue that in its current form, our food system is not safe or nutritious. So there are four things that I think should keep us up at night when we think about the food system. And the first one is the fact that of all human activities on Earth, the food system is responsible for most of our biodiversity loss and of our soil degradation. And that means that we lose our ecosystems. And what do we do when that happens? Which leads to the second one, is the fact that we tend to use more chemicals. And these chemicals further degrade our ecosystems. And by the way, these chemicals, they pollute our soils, and it does not end there. They also turn up in our food, in our veggies, in our meat, so you can trace them. But also, these chemicals, they pollute our water resources. The third one is the fact that in this current form, our agricultural system requires about 70% of our freshwater resources. Now, in a water-scarce country like South Africa, that is not sustainable. The last one that really worries me is the fact that our food system emits what we call greenhouse gases. And these gases contribute to global warming and climate change. So, when you see all these factors, it means that the landscapes that are supposed to support our food production are becoming weakened. They are increasingly becoming vulnerable to the shocks and stresses of climate change. And this has got further implications for our environment because it's losing the resilience, that is, its ability to bounce back from these shocks and stresses. With South Africa being classified as having much of degraded soils, now this trend has major implications for our land reform and for our food security. So I would argue, therefore, that if our food system is responsible for the decline of our bee populations, it is not safe. And if it degrades the quality of our water resources, it is not safe. And if it accelerates climate change, definitely it is not safe.
Thank you, Mikululi. So we know it's a lot to take in, and especially if you're hearing some of this for the first time today. And unfortunately, the bad news doesn't stop there. So obviously at WWF, we've been tracking the ecological impacts of food production for a number of years. But recently, in the past couple of years, it's become impossible not to notice similarly negative trends in our own society. We are definitely headed in the wrong direction. On the one hand, we have a food system that's extremely productive, produces enough to provide a nutritious, largely vegetarian diet to all the people on this planet and in South Africa. On the other hand, we have, and actually allied to that, we have a constitution that protects our access to adequate nutrition and food. And yet, we have 22% of South Africans who don't know where their next meal will come from. So we have this really stark contrast of enough and real hunger. And then an absurdity in the system is alongside that, 33%, so that's 1 in every 3 calories, goes to waste. It's never eaten. So the evidence that what is supposed to be nourishing us is actually killing us, is mounting. And really we see that in hunger and food poverty, but most distressingly, in something that none of us should be tolerating, is the actually growing rates of stunting in this country. So that means that a large portion, about a quarter of our children, will never reach their full potential, either mentally or physically or both, because of a lack of nutrients in those crucial early days. They are forever disadvantaged. So there's a future for us that is really disturbing as a nation. And we also have in South Africa what is, in fact, allied to childhood stunting, often seen as overeating, but a better description might be the malnourished obese. We have a massive trend towards overweight, unhealthy population, eating the wrong things, and largely because that's all we can afford. In the Western Cape last year, 5 out of every 10 deaths were as a result of lifestyle and diet-related diseases. So I think it's really clear that if you have a system that is directly contributing to a public health catastrophe, it is not safe.
So this is why our conversation today becomes so important. If our food system is responsible for the ecological breakdown of our environment, it definitely is not safe. So the trends that we've outlined today of poverty, diet shifts, climate change, ecological breakdown are quite eye-opening. And this is why we need to think about how can we become part of creating the future that we want.
Thanks, Vikululi. Yes, this question of the future we want and how will we feed 10 billion in 2050, I think is one that many of you here are very working very hard towards an answer for. But I imagine none of us actually have a clear answer of that. And in an effort to provide some insight, WWF South Africa commissioned a study from the International Institute of Applied Systems Analytics, the same institute in Austria that does the global projections for agriculture towards 2050. And we asked them, what is South Africa likely to look like in 2050? And will we be able to feed our population? So, and perhaps let me correct myself there and not use the word feed again. Will we be able to nourish our population? So the answers that came back were with as much certainty as one can have into the future. There's a lot that's uncertain, but there are a number of things that are evident. Our population will continue to grow, potentially by 10 to 17 million people. Incomes will continue to rise. Urbanization will continue to increase and rapidly. This will result in a demand for commodities doubling. And in the case of meat and dairy, the expected increase is around 200%. Which is really a radical number when you think of all the land and energy and water that those two commodities require of us. The study found that South Africa would, in 2050, would almost certainly be able to provide for that massive increase. And this reflects much of the modeling around the world. It's dependent on an increasing productivity per hectare and cropping intensity. It's required, in terms of the modeling, only a small amount of increased irrigation land, and that's obviously critical. But one of the researchers who was working on the project said to me that it was the most interesting piece of research of this nature that she'd ever done, because no other country in the world has this really complex duality where you have over 2 million smallholder farmers coexisting alongside a very small and sophisticated commercial farming group that produces most of our food into the formal retail chain. And I think that what that shows you is that it's very difficult to predict where we're going. It's very difficult to predict what our land use and agricultural practices will be. It's difficult to predict what we'll be eating. And come 2050, we'll be feeling the full effects of climate change. So really, it's so critical that we have these conversations now so that we can take the near-term actions that are required to protect our future.
So just as we have already learned that the problem of climate change will not be effectively solved if we consider it as a one-dimensional problem. That means nourishing the nation will also require multidisciplinarity. So to arrive at a food system that is resilient, productive, we need to adopt a decidedly different approach. And we need an approach that looks at the entire system. Fortunately, we can do this. Together, if we pull together, we can arrive at a point where we have a food system that serves us. Now, to bring about transformative change in the food system, WWF has proposed and adopted 5 practical approaches. The first one is regenerative agriculture and fisheries, and the second one is efficient use of water resources.
And the third is that link between our landscapes and our markets, responsible sourcing. The fourth is reducing waste. And the fifth is dietary shift.
So the first 2 really excite me because they start to address the challenges that are at the production level of the food value chain. So in my work in both agriculture and fisheries, I've seen that maintaining livelihoods and feeding and nourishing the nation requires a tough balancing act. This is why we need to start really focusing on conserving the soils and regenerating our ecosystems. But there's also the challenge of water. We need to be more mindful about how we use water. We need to rethink bulk irrigation systems. In fact, we need to adopt new technologies.
And while the good work is happening in our landscapes and our seascapes, we need a market that is sophisticated and capable of understanding how to incentivize, support, and source from these important efforts. I think that we heard this morning from Mr. Mahale the really critical role that business will play going forward in shifting the system. And in South Africa, and in fact around the world, we're fortunate in having some sophisticated and improving sustainability codes, codes that reinforce and build resilient, productive landscapes. And from WWF's perspective, we support those that are rooted in evidence, rooted in science-based targets. And whilst you will often hear it characterize market concentration, the ownership of a few companies of most of the food system as a negative, in the case of shifting sourcing, it would take only a few companies to commit to science-based targets for climate and for nature to show a radical shift in the system. So it's a very exciting opportunity, and one that we should really be looking towards those who we source our foods from as consumers to be showing evidence of greater care right through the value chain. The next one, food waste, to my mind, and I'm sure most of you will agree, is a no-brainer. And one of the reasons that it serves everybody. Nobody likes to waste food, and nobody likes the additional costs either that it builds into the system. National government is committed to the Sustainable Development Goals and has signed on to Target 12.3, which commits us to halving food waste by 2030. And we have representatives here in the audience today who are working really hard to realize that goal. So again, it starts on farm. That's where the significant impacts sit. But it also means that that spinach that's festering in the back of my fridge is a reminder to me that we all have a role to play in this. This is a small step, but a powerful one that we can all play a part in. The fifth and final one, which again links all of these things, is a lot more complicated. Dietary shift requires cooperation of all sectors, of all stakeholders at all levels. And the truth is, in South Africa, we eat really badly. We love our meat and dairy, but we also love our highly processed, high in sugars, fats, sodium foods that really, to all rights, should be dyed bright pink. So, until such time that we get that, we're going to have to start seeing, again, an opportunity for science-based targets to be operationalized into our food system, where we understand how to create or nudge through price and convenience and availability the type of diet that works within nature's limits. And this really has to be more than labels. Remember, if it's not nutritious and not safe, it's not food.
So, Tatiana, your call for dietary shifts makes me realize that I actually grew up eating the right food and maybe in the right quantities. You see, where I grew up in the Eastern Cape, we used to eat fresh veggies and fruit just from our garden. But when I go back nowadays to the Eastern Cape, I find those gardens and those amasimi that used to nourish the people unplanted. And this is largely because people are so reliant on the food that is so available out there, which is the wrong food. So I think have we figured out everything? No. There's still so much that we don't know. But I also think that there is much that we know that we can start taking action now. So if we know that regenerative agriculture and fisheries is the right way to go, supported by responsible sourcing, we can go a long way in protecting our biodiversity and in ensuring that we rebuild our soils. And if we add to that mix powerful strategies of food waste and nutrition, we can start to build a food system that serves both people and the planet. And we must not forget that we need also to address poverty that is rampant and make sure that there is equity in the food chain. And if we do that, I think we will build everlasting solutions. But today, we want to remind you that the solutions for the future food systems are not anywhere than sitting with you, the food leaders in business, in government, in NGOs, in academia.
So we'd like to invite you to join us in this conversation, in a conversation over food and sharing a meal, a conversation that aims to transform relationships, build trust, and fuel cooperation, so that together we are able to nourish our beautiful nation now and in the future. Thank you.